At my wife's funeral, my daughter-in-law told me, "No need to come tomorrow. We already buried her today, without you." Minutes later, I saw the coffin picture on Instagram. The next day, inheritance meeting. I entered the notary's office with an envelope. When the clerk opened it, her face turned pale in front of everyone. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I was 20 minutes late to my wife's funeral. 20 minutes. That's all it took for them to decide I didn't deserve to say goodbye to Margaret. 40 years of marriage, 3 years of watching her slip away piece by piece, and I missed the beginning of her funeral by 20 minutes because of construction on Route 95. The church parking lot was full. I had to park 3 blocks away, and by the time I walked to the entrance, my chest was tight and my legs were shaking. Not from the walk, from knowing that inside that building, in that wooden box, was the woman who had been my whole world since I was 25 years old. I reached for the heavy oak door, my hand trembling, when it swung open from the inside. Lily stood there, my daughter-in-law, 32 years old, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly medication budget. Her face perfectly composed except for her eyes. Those eyes were hard. "Ross." She said my name like it was something distasteful. "Lily, I'm sorry I'm late. There was construction and You're not coming in." I blinked. Surely I'd misheard. "What?" She stepped fully into the doorway, blocking my path. She wasn't a large woman, but in that moment she seemed immovable. "You heard me. You're not welcome here." My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind her I could hear the minister's voice, steady and solemn, saying words about Margaret that I couldn't quite make out. "Lily, this is my wife's funeral. I need to—" "Your wife?" Her voice rose slightly, enough that an elderly couple walking past turned to stare. She lowered it again, but the venom remained. "You didn't act like she was your wife these past 3 years. David and I had to handle everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Handle everything? You barely—" "Don't!" She held up one perfectly manicured finger. "Don't you dare. We did everything we could while you isolated her, while you kept her locked up in that house like she was your prisoner." I felt dizzy. The world tilted slightly. "I took care of her. Every single day. Save it, Ross. Nobody wants to hear your excuses. Not today." She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "The service is already underway. You missed it. There's no point in you disrupting everything now. I just want to see her." My voice cracked. "Please, I just want to say goodbye." For a moment, something flickered across her face. If I didn't know better, I might have thought it was pity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You should have thought about that before you decided to show up late to your own wife's funeral." She started to close the door. "Don't bother coming to the house afterward. We're handling the reception. Family only." The door clicked shut. I heard the lock turn. I stood there on the church steps, my hand still halfway raised to knock, to plead, to beg. Inside, the organ began to play. I recognized the hymn. Margaret had picked it out 2 years ago, back when she could still make decisions like that, back when she still knew who I was most days. My legs gave out. I sat down heavily on the stone steps, not caring that they were cold and damp from the morning rain. People walked past me, friends, neighbors, people from Margaret's book club that she'd had to leave when the disease got too bad. Some glanced at me with confusion. Others looked away quickly, embarrassed. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. Maybe David would answer. Maybe my son would override his wife's cruelty and let me in to say goodbye to his mother. But when I unlocked the screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Instagram, Lily's account. She'd posted a photo just 8 minutes ago. The image was of Margaret's casket, covered in white roses, the flowers she'd loved. The caption read, "Saying goodbye to the most wonderful woman I've ever known. She was more than a mother-in-law. She was a second mother to me, surrounded by love in her final moments. Rest in peace, Margaret. You deserved so much better." The comments were already flooding in. People I didn't recognize, offering condolences, praising Lily for being such a devoted daughter-in-law, saying how lucky Margaret was to have her. I scrolled up. There were more photos. Lily arranging the flowers this morning. Lily choosing the music. Lily greeting guests at the door, the same door she'd just slammed in my face. Not a single mention of me. It was as if I'd never existed. As if the man who'd bathed Margaret when she could no longer do it herself, who'd fed her when she forgot how to use a spoon, who'd held her through the terrifying nights when she didn't know where she was or who she was, had simply vanished. My phone buzzed, an email notification. From Jenkins and Associates, attorneys at law. The subject line read, Estate Settlement Meeting, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Tomorrow, less than 24 hours after my wife died, and they were already dividing up what remained of our life together. I sat on those steps for another hour until the service ended and people began filing out. They gave me wide berth, as if grief might be contagious. David emerged with Lily on his arm. He saw me, and for just a second, his face crumpled. But Lily whispered something in his ear, and he straightened, looking away as they walked to their car. My son. My only child. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked down the aisle at his wedding. He looked right through me as if I were glass. The funeral director came out last. He approached me carefully, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, but we need to lock up the church. The burial is private, family only. Mrs. Lily Hayes made the arrangements. I nodded slowly, pushing myself to my feet. My knees protested. Everything hurt. Can I at least know where they're burying her? He hesitated, then scribbled something on a business card and pressed it into my hand. Oakwood Cemetery, Section C, Plot 47. I'm sorry for your loss, sir. I drove to Oakwood, parked at a distance and watched through the trees as they lowered my wife into the ground. I was too far away to hear the prayers. Too far away to throw dirt on the coffin like you're supposed to. Too far away to matter. When everyone left, I walked to the fresh grave. Knelt in the mud beside it, not caring that it soaked through my pants. Placed my hand on the disturbed earth. I'm sorry I was late, Maggie, I whispered. I tried. I really tried. The email reminder chimed again on my phone. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., the law office of Jenkins and Associates. I looked at that brown envelope in my car's glove compartment, the one I'd prepared 3 weeks ago, when Margaret was still clinging to life, still occasionally squeezing my hand to let me know she heard me, the one she'd asked me to prepare in one of her last truly lucid moments. Make sure David knows the truth, she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. Make sure he understands what you gave up, what you gave me. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., they would find out exactly what they'd thrown away when they locked me out of that church. Tomorrow they would learn what Margaret had wanted them to know all along. But tonight, I would sit in the empty house that still smelled like hospital equipment and Margaret's lavender lotion, and I would let myself cry for the last time, because tomorrow everything would change. The house was too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years, and the silence pressed down on me like a physical weight. No more oxygen machine humming in the bedroom. No more medical alert system beeping every few hours. No more soft confusion of Margaret asking me who I was, where she was, why everything felt wrong. Just silence. I picked up the brown envelope from the counter. It was thicker than it looked, years compressed into paper and ink. I'd started documenting everything about 18 months ago, when it became clear that David was pulling away, and Lily was building a wall between us. I opened it slowly, looking at what I'd compiled. Each page was a small piece of proof that I'd been there, that I'd tried, that Margaret hadn't been alone, even though everyone seemed determined to believe otherwise. The first document was the diagnosis, 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. I remembered that appointment like it had been yesterday. Margaret had been forgetting things for months, small things at first, where she put her keys, what day of the week it was, but then the small things became bigger. She got lost, driving home from the grocery store she'd shopped at for 20 years. She called David by her dead brother's name. She looked at me one morning and asked me very politely who I was and what I was doing in her bedroom. Dr. Morrison didn't sugarcoat it. Early onset Alzheimer's. It's aggressive. She's 62, Ross. This isn't the slow decline we usually see in patients in their 80s. You're looking at maybe 5 years before she won't recognize anyone at all. 5 years. He'd been optimistic. I drove home from that appointment in complete silence. Margaret sat beside me, looking out the window, humming a song she couldn't quite remember the words to. When we got home, I called David immediately. He answered on the 5th ring. Hey, Dad, kinda busy right now. Can I call you back? Your mother has Alzheimer's. The words came out flat, emotionless. I think I was in shock. Silence. Then, what? Are you sure? We just came from the neurologist. It's confirmed. Early onset. It's going to be bad, David. I'm going to need help. Oh, God. Dad, Okay. Let me talk to Lily. We'll come by this weekend. We'll figure something out. They didn't come that weekend. Lily called Saturday morning saying she'd come down with a migraine. They'd reschedule. The next weekend, it was a work conference David couldn't miss. The weekend after that, Lily's mother was visiting. By the time they finally showed up, 6 weeks had passed, and Margaret had already declined noticeably. She knew who David was that day, one of her good days. But she kept calling Lily Sarah, the name of David's high school girlfriend. Lily hadn't found it amusing. I picked up the next document in the pile, my retirement paperwork. I'd filed it exactly 2 months after the diagnosis. I was 62, same as Margaret. We'd planned to work another 3 years, to build up our savings a bit more, maybe take that trip to Ireland we'd always talked about. Instead, I took early retirement with reduced benefits. Someone had to be home with Margaret full time. She couldn't be left alone anymore. We'd already had 2 incidents where she'd turned on the stove and forgotten about it. Once I'd found her standing in the backyard in her nightgown at 2 in the morning, convinced she needed to feed chickens we'd never owned. "Dad, you don't have to quit your job." David had said this over the phone. He hadn't visited in 3 weeks. "There are facilities, professional caregivers. You can't just throw away your career." "It's not my career anymore, David. I have 14 months until full retirement. The difference in my pension isn't worth leaving your mother with strangers." "But you're sacrificing so much." "That's what you do when you love someone." He'd gone quiet. Then, "Lily and I will help financially, whatever you need." They sent a check for $500. Once, I never asked again. I flipped through more papers. Medical bills, so many medical bills. Margaret's insurance was decent, but it didn't cover everything. The medications alone ran nearly $800 a month. Then there were the adult diapers when she reached that stage, the safety rails we installed throughout the house, the special locks on the doors after she tried to leave in the middle of the night and nearly got hit by a car. I'd sold my truck, the one I'd bought used and restored over the course of 2 years. Got $7,500 for it. That money lasted about 9 months. I took out a home equity loan for $22,000. That was supposed to be our retirement cushion, our emergency fund. It went to medical equipment, in-home nursing assessments, and a brief 3-month stint with a part-time caregiver when I got pneumonia and couldn't care for Margaret myself. David and Lily came to visit during that period. I was still recovering, weak and exhausted. Margaret was having a bad week, barely recognizing anyone, agitated and frightened most of the time. "Dad, you look terrible," David had said, standing in the doorway of our bedroom where I was resting. "You can't keep doing this." "What choice do I have?" "Put her in a home. A good one. You're killing yourself." "She's my wife, David. I'm not putting her away like she's broken." Lily appeared behind him. "Ross, that's not fair. Care facilities aren't prisons. They're equipped for this. You're not. I'm managing. Are you?" Lily looked around the room, at the piles of medical supplies, the medication schedule taped to the wall, the baby monitor we used so I could hear if Margaret needed me in the night. "This isn't healthy, for either of you. What would be healthy is if my son visited his mother more than once every 2 months. David's face had flushed red. "That's not fair. You know I have a demanding job, and Lily has her anxiety. Being around sick people triggers her panic attacks. Margaret isn't sick people. She's your mother." They left shortly after. I didn't see them again for 7 weeks. I found the calendar I'd kept, every day marked with notes. David called, talked for 6 minutes. David promised to visit on Sunday, didn't show up. Margaret asked for David today, told her he was working. The lies I'd told Margaret to protect her from the truth became part of my daily routine. She would look at me with those confused eyes and ask where her son was, why he never came to see her, and I would make up excuses. "He's on a business trip. He called earlier. You were sleeping. He's coming this weekend." Anything but the truth. That her son had chosen to stay away because witnessing her decline was too uncomfortable. That his wife had decided Margaret's disease was something to be feared and avoided rather than faced with compassion. There was a printout of text messages, dated about 18 months ago. I'd started documenting everything at that point. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Me. "Margaret had a fall today. She's okay, but very shaken. Could you come by?" David. "Is she in the hospital?" Me. "No, but she's asking for you." David. "If she's not hospitalized, I think she'll be okay until the weekend." He didn't come that weekend. 3 weeks later. Me. "Margaret's having a good day today. She's very alert. Would be a good time to visit." David. "Lily has plans. Maybe next week?" There was no visit the next week. 2 months later. Me. "It's Margaret's birthday. She turned 64 today. I know she'd love to see you. David, can't today, Dad, but tell her happy birthday from us. I'd made a small cake, just the two of us. Margaret was confused about whose birthday it was, but ate the cake happily. That night she cried, though she couldn't articulate why. Some part of her knew her son hadn't come. The documents went on and on. A timeline of absence, of promises broken, of a son who slowly faded from his mother's life while she was still desperately trying to hold on to him. I found the folder of medical records from the last year. This was when things got truly difficult. Margaret stopped walking without assistance, then stopped walking at all. The hospital bed in our living room. The feeding tube when swallowing became too difficult. The hospice nurse who came 3 times a week to help with medications and teach me how to keep Margaret comfortable. You're doing a remarkable job, Nurse Patricia had told me more than once. Most spouses can't handle this level of care at home. They burn out. I promised her I wouldn't let her die among strangers. Does she have other family, children, a son? Does he help? I never answered that question directly. David and Lily came to visit exactly 4 times in that final year. The visits were brief, uncomfortable. David couldn't look at his mother properly. Lily wouldn't touch her, standing several feet back from the bed, as if Alzheimer's could somehow jump from person to person. The last visit was about 3 weeks before Margaret died. David had stood in the doorway of what used to be our living room and was now essentially a hospital room. How much longer? He'd asked quietly. The hospice nurse says maybe a month, maybe less. Is she? Does she know we're here? I looked at Margaret, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and labored. I don't know. I like to think some part of her does. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I haven't been here more. I couldn't handle seeing her like this. I know. Do you hate me for it? I'd considered the question carefully. No, I'm just sad that you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing you weren't here, and I can't fix that for you. They left after 20 minutes. Lily had waited in the car. Now, sitting in the empty house with all these documents spread before me, I felt the weight of those 3 years pressing down. I'd given up my retirement, my savings, my health, my social life. I'd become nurse, cook, cleaner, and companion to a woman who increasingly didn't know who I was, and I'd do it again. Every single day, I'd choose Margaret, but tomorrow, David and Lily would learn exactly what that choice had cost, and they would have to live with the knowledge that while I was making that choice every single day, they were making a different one. They were choosing to stay away. I arrived at Jenkins and Associates at 9:45 in the morning, 15 minutes early. I'd learned my lesson about being late. The office was in one of those renovated historic buildings downtown, all exposed brick and modern glass. The kind of place that charges $300 an hour just to sit in the waiting room. I wondered who was paying for this. Probably Margaret's estate. Probably money we'd saved together over decades, now going to lawyers to divide up what little remained. The receptionist gave me a polite smile. Mr. Hayes, they're expecting you. Conference room B, second door on your left. I walked down the hallway, the brown envelope tucked under my arm. It felt heavier than it should, like it was made of lead instead of paper. My hands were steady, though. I'd cried myself empty last night. Today was just about facts. The conference room had a long mahogany table and leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. David was already there, sitting next to Lily. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. Lily looked impeccable as always, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a gray suit that screamed expensive. Across from them sat Margaret's sister, Joan. She was 70 years old, sharp as a tack, and had never particularly liked me. She'd thought Margaret was marrying beneath her station when we got engaged 40 years ago. I was a construction worker. Margaret was a teacher with a master's degree. Joan had made her opinions very clear at our wedding, but Joan caught my eye as I entered and gave me a small nod. Something in that gesture told me she knew more than she'd let on. Ross. David stood up, uncertain. Hi. David. I didn't offer to shake his hand. I just took a seat at the opposite end of the table, as far from them as I could get. Lily didn't acknowledge me at all. She was scrolling through her phone, probably checking the comments on her Instagram posts about what a devoted daughter-in-law she'd been. The door opened again, and a man in his 50s entered, carrying a leather portfolio. Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Jenkins. I'll be overseeing the settlement of Mrs. Margaret Hayes' estate. I'm sorry for your loss. He sat at the head of the table and opened his portfolio, pulling out several documents. This should be relatively straightforward. Mrs. Hayes left a valid will, properly witnessed and notarized. I'll read the relevant portions, and then we'll need signatures from the beneficiaries. Lily finally looked up from her phone, giving Jenkins her full attention. Jenkins cleared his throat and began reading. I, Margaret Ann Hayes, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I revoke all previous wills and codicils. Standard legal language followed. Then, to my beloved husband, Ross Hayes, I leave my personal effects, including all jewelry, photographs, and items of sentimental value. I felt something twist in my chest. The jewelry wasn't worth much. Margaret had never been one for expensive things. But her wedding ring, the locket I'd given her on our 25th anniversary, the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, those mattered. Jenkins continued. To my sister, Joan Mitchell, I leave the sum of $10,000 and my collection of first edition books, which she has always admired. Joan nodded slowly, her face neutral. The remainder of my estate, including the house at 42 Oak Street, all bank accounts, investment accounts, and any other assets not specifically mentioned, I leave to be divided equally between my sister, Joan Mitchell, and my son, David Hayes. Lily's face broke into a smile. David looked relieved. The house was worth about $380,000. We'd paid off the mortgage 8 years ago. The bank accounts had maybe $40,000 left after I'd depleted our savings for Margaret's care. Still, David was looking at close to $200,000. Is that it? Lily asked, her voice eager. Jenkins held up one hand. There's an addendum. Mrs. Hayes added this clause approximately 4 months before her passing, while she was still deemed mentally competent by 2 independent physicians. 4 months ago, that was during one of Margaret's last truly lucid periods. We'd had 3 consecutive days where she knew exactly who she was, who I was, and what was happening to her. It had been both a blessing and a curse. She'd been aware enough to know what she was losing. What kind of addendum? David asked, his voice suddenly wary. Jenkins pulled out another document. Before the distribution of assets can occur, Mrs. Hayes requested that a specific envelope be opened and read aloud in the presence of all beneficiaries and the executor of her estate. The envelope was left in my custody, with specific instructions that it not be opened until this meeting. He looked at me. Mr. Hayes, I believe you're holding that envelope? Every eye in the room turned to me. I placed the brown envelope on the table and slid it toward Jenkins. My hand was steady. Inside, I was screaming. Jenkins opened it carefully. His eyebrows rose as he began reading the contents silently. He looked at Joan, then at David, then finally at me. Something like sadness crossed his face. These are medical records, he said slowly. Extremely detailed medical records spanning the last 3 years of Mrs. Hayes's illness. Lily frowned. Why would we need to see medical records? We know she had Alzheimer's. Mrs. Hayes wanted you to understand the full scope of her care. Jenkins pulled out the first document. This is from Dr. Morrison, her neurologist. It details every appointment, every medication adjustment, every crisis. Every appointment shows one name listed as the accompanying family member, Ross Hayes. He pulled out more papers. Here are the records from her primary care physician. 28 appointments over 3 years. Ross Hayes present for all 28. More papers. Hospice care documentation. The nurse's notes indicate that Mr. Hayes was the primary caregiver, handling all aspects of Mrs. Hayes's care, including bathing, feeding, medication administration, and overnight monitoring. David's face had gone pale. Dad, we knew you were taking care of her. Jenkins wasn't finished. He pulled out a thick stack of papers, and I recognized them as the ones I'd added to the envelope myself. These appear to be personal documentation kept by Mr. Hayes. A daily log of Mrs. Hayes's condition, including notes about family contact. He began reading, his voice neutral, but the words devastating. March 15th, 2021. Margaret had a difficult night. She didn't recognize me this morning. Called me by her father's name. She asked about David 3 times today. I told her he'd call later. He didn't. Lily shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Jenkins continued. June 22nd, 2021. Margaret's 64th birthday. Made her favorite cake. She was alert enough to know it was a special day but couldn't remember what. Kept saying someone was supposed to be here. David sent a text but didn't visit. David's head was down, staring at the table. November 3rd, 2021. Margaret fell trying to get to the bathroom alone. I found her on the floor, crying. No injuries, thank God. Called David at 10 p.m. He texted back the next morning asking if everything was okay. I said yes. It wasn't. Stop. David's voice was hoarse. Please stop. But Jenkins kept reading, entry after entry. 3 years compressed into painful, specific moments. The nights Margaret screamed for her son and he didn't come. The holidays spent with just the two of us. The promises David made to visit that turned into excuses. The steady, relentless documentation of absence. Lily's face had lost all its color. This is manipulative, she said, but her voice was shaking. This is Ross trying to make us feel guilty. Joan spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the room like ice. Be quiet, Lily. Lily's mouth snapped shut. Jenkins pulled out another document. There's one more thing. A letter from Margaret herself, written during one of her lucid periods and certified by her physician as having been written while she was of sound mind. He began to read, and Margaret's voice seemed to fill the room, speaking from beyond the grave. To my son David, if you're reading this, it means I've passed. I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you, from the moment you were born, but I also need you to know the truth. These last 3 years have been the hardest of my life, not just because of the disease, but because I lost you long before the Alzheimer's took my memory. You stopped visiting. You stopped calling. You chose your comfort over my need for you. Your father never made that choice. He stayed with me through every terrible moment. He sacrificed his retirement, his savings, his health. He never complained. He never wavered. I'm asking you to read these documents not to punish you, but to help you understand what true love looks like. And I'm asking you to take care of him now, the way he took care of me. He'll be alone. Don't let him be forgotten the way you let me be forgotten. The silence in the room was absolute. David was crying openly now, his shoulders shaking. Lily looked like she'd been slapped. Joan reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. I'm sorry, Ross. I didn't know. Margaret never said how bad it was. She didn't want people to know, I said quietly. She didn't want David to feel obligated out of guilt. But she wanted him to know now, Joan said. After. Yes. Jenkins carefully gathered the documents. The will stands as written. The estate will be divided as specified. But Mrs. Hayes was clear that these documents be read before any distributions occurred. She wanted the truth on record. Lily stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. Come on, David. We don't have to sit here and be attacked. David didn't move. He was staring at the pile of papers on the table like they were a bomb that had just detonated in his lap. David. Lily's voice was sharp. You knew, David said softly, still looking at the papers. You knew Mom was asking for me. You told me Dad was exaggerating. You said he was trying to manipulate us into giving up our lives. I was protecting you. From what? David looked up at her and I saw something I'd never seen before on my son's face. Anger, real anger. From my dying mother? Lily's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. David turned to me, tears streaming down his face. Dad, I don't know what to say. Oh, what? I looked at my son, at the man who'd locked me out of his mother's funeral just yesterday, and I felt something break inside me. Not my heart. That was already broken. Something else. The desperate hope that maybe, somehow, we could fix this. You don't have to say anything, David. It's all there in the documents. 3 years of truth. You can't change it. You can only decide what you do with it. I stood up, leaving the envelope and all its painful contents on that expensive mahogany table. Keep the house. Keep the money. I don't want any of it. I just wanted you to know what it cost, what she gave up hoping you'd come back, what I gave up trying to protect her from knowing you wouldn't. I walked toward the door. Dad, wait. David's voice broke. I stopped, but didn't turn around. The funeral was yesterday, David. You made sure I couldn't be there. There's nothing left to wait for. I left them sitting in that conference room, surrounded by the wreckage of their own choices, and I walked out into the morning sun. For the first time in 3 years, I had nowhere I needed to be. The feeling wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was close. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour after leaving the attorney's office. My hands were on the steering wheel, but I couldn't seem to make them turn the key. The engine was off, the car was silent, and I just sat there, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. My phone buzzed. David. I looked at the screen, but didn't answer. It buzzed again and again. On the fourth call, I turned the phone off completely. What was there to say? Everything that needed saying had been said in that conference room. Margaret had made sure of it. I thought about the night she'd asked me to document everything. It was about 4 months before she died, during those 3 miraculous days when the fog had lifted and she was herself again. We were sitting in the living room, her hospital bed positioned so she could see out the window at the bird feeder I'd hung specifically for her. "Ross," she'd said, her voice weak but clear, "I need you to write everything down." "Write what down, honey?" "How it's been, with David, with me, all of it." She'd turned to look at me, and her eyes were sharp with awareness. "He doesn't know, does he? He thinks you're being dramatic, that I'm not as bad as you say." I'd tried to protest, to protect her from that knowledge, but she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Don't lie to me, not now. I don't have enough time left for lies." She'd taken a shaky breath. "I know my son, Ross. I know he's been staying away. I know why. He's scared, and Lily makes it easier for him to be scared. Margaret, let me finish." Her voice was firm. "I want you to document everything, every day, every appointment, every time he promises to visit and doesn't, every time I ask for him and you have to make excuses. Why? What good would that do? Because when I'm gone, he needs to understand. He needs to know what you sacrificed, what you gave." Tears had rolled down her face. "And he needs to know that I knew, that I saw his absence even through the disease. Some things the Alzheimer's couldn't take from me. The pain of missing my son was one of them." I'd started the documentation that night. Every entry felt like a betrayal at first, like I was cataloging my son's failures for some future punishment. But as the months went on, I realized it wasn't about punishment, it was about truth. Margaret had one more lucid day about 2 weeks before she died. She'd asked if I'd done what she requested. I showed her the notebook, nearly full by then. She'd paged through it slowly, tears falling on the pages. "This is good," she'd whispered. "This is important." "Is it though? Will it change anything?" "Maybe not." She'd looked at me with such clarity it hurt. "But at least he'll know. He'll know that I never stopped loving him, even when he stopped showing up. And he'll know what you gave up for me. That matters, Ross. Even if it doesn't change anything, it matters." Now, sitting in my car, I wondered if she'd been right. David's face in that conference room had been devastated. But devastation wasn't the same as change. People could feel terrible about their choices and still make the same ones over and over again. My phone buzzed again, even though it was supposed to be off. The battery must have had enough charge to register one more notification. I turned it back on. Text from David. "Dad, please, we need to talk. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was that bad." Another text. "Lily is saying things I never realized before, about how she discouraged me from visiting. I'm so sorry." And another. "I can't believe I let you stand outside Mom's funeral. What kind of person does that?" I stared at the messages. Part of me wanted to respond, to accept this olive branch, to let David back into my life because he was my son and I loved him. But another part, the part that had spent 3 years alone with Margaret's declining mind, that had watched her die inch by inch while our son lived his comfortable life across town, that part was tired. I typed slowly. "You let it be that bad because it was easier than facing it. That's the truth. What you do with that truth is up to you." I hit send and turned the phone off again. The drive home was a blur. The house felt different when I walked in. The hospital bed was gone, picked up yesterday morning by the hospice company. The oxygen tanks were gone. The medications were gone. All the equipment that had defined our lives for the past year had been removed with efficient speed. What remained was just a house, not even a home anymore, just a building with too many memories in every corner. I walked through the rooms slowly, the kitchen where I'd learned to puree food when Margaret could no longer chew properly, the bathroom where I'd installed safety rails and a shower chair, our bedroom where I'd slept in a recliner for 8 months because Margaret needed the bed, and I needed to be close enough to hear if she called for me. In the closet, Margaret's clothes still hung in neat rows. I'd need to deal with those eventually. Joan had offered to help. I'd said yes because I didn't think I could do it alone. On Margaret's nightstand, I found her journal, the one she'd kept in the early days of her diagnosis, before the disease took her ability to write. I'd read it once before, the day she gave me permission to document everything. But I sat on the edge of the bed and read it again now. The entries were heartbreaking in their simplicity. October 10th, 2020. Dr. Morrison confirmed it today. Alzheimer's. I cried all the way home. Ross held my hand the entire drive. Didn't say anything, just held my hand. I don't know what I did to deserve him. November 2nd, 2020. Had lunch with David and Lily today. Told them about the diagnosis. David cried. Lily looked uncomfortable. She kept saying things about research and experimental treatments. I could tell she wanted to leave. When they did leave, I told Ross I thought Lily was scared of me. He said I was imagining things. I wasn't. January 7th, 2021. Forgot how to make coffee this morning. I've made coffee every morning for 40 years. Ross found me crying in the kitchen trying to remember the steps. He made the coffee and we sat together and he told me it was okay. It doesn't feel okay. I feel like I'm disappearing. March 20th, 2021. Haven't seen David in 6 weeks. He calls once a week, but the conversations are getting shorter. Ross says he's busy with work. I know that's not the whole truth. My son is avoiding me because watching me decline is too hard. I understand, but it still hurts. July 4th, 2021. It's Independence Day. We used to have big barbecues, the whole family. Today, it's just me and Ross. I had a good day today, remembered most things. I asked Ross to invite David and Lily over. He made the call. They said they had other plans. Ross lied and said that's what I had guessed anyway. He doesn't know I heard the whole conversation. I heard David say, "Maybe next time, Dad." There won't be many next times. The entries became shorter after that, harder to read. Margaret's handwriting deteriorated, the words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence as if she'd forgotten what she was trying to say. The last entry was dated September 15th, 2021, about a year and a half before she died. I don't know how many more of these I can write. The words don't come like they used to, but I need to say this while I still can. Ross, if you ever read this, I want you to know you gave me the most beautiful life. You gave me love that never wavered, not even when I became someone you didn't recognize. David is my son, and I love him, but you are my heart. When I'm gone, please don't be alone forever. Please find some happiness. You deserve it more than anyone I've ever known. I closed the journal carefully, my hands shaking, set it back on the nightstand exactly where Margaret had always kept it. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I considered not answering, but it rang again, more insistent this time. Joan stood on my porch holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Thought you might need company," she said simply. I stepped aside to let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, the coffee between us. "That was quite a meeting," Joan said after a long silence. "It was what Margaret wanted. I know. She called me about 2 months before she died, one of her last clear days, asked me to make sure those documents were included in the envelope, asked me to be there when it was opened." Joan took a sip of her coffee. "She was protecting you, Ross. She knew David and Lily would contest anything you said. But they couldn't contest her own words. Did it matter, though? David looked devastated, but that doesn't undo 3 years of absence." "No," Joan agreed. "It doesn't, but maybe that wasn't the point." I looked at her, questioning. "Maybe the point was that you needed them to know. You've carried this alone for so long, Ross." "The caregiving, yes, but also the knowledge of how alone you were in it. Margaret wanted witnesses to your sacrifice. She wanted someone besides you to know what it cost. I didn't do it for recognition. Of course not. But that doesn't mean you didn't deserve it." We sat in silence for a while. Finally, Joan said, "What will you do now?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been so focused on taking care of Margaret for so long, I forgot what it's like to just be myself." "Then maybe that's where you start. Figure out who Ross Hayes is when he's not a caregiver, when he's not a husband, just Ross." After Joan left, I stood in the middle of my empty house and tried to imagine that. Who was I without Margaret to care for? Without a son who needed me, even if he didn't realize it? Without the constant weight of responsibility that had defined my last 3 years? I had no idea. But as the afternoon light faded and the house grew dark around me, I thought maybe not knowing was okay. Maybe it was even necessary. Margaret had given me permission to start over. She'd put it in writing, in her journal, in her will, in every document in that brown envelope. The question was whether I was brave enough to take it. 3 days after the meeting at the attorney's office, David showed up at my door. I'd been expecting it. Not hoping for it exactly, but expecting it. The way you expect rain when you see dark clouds gathering. Inevitable, but not necessarily welcome. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his hair uncombed, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt I recognized from college. My son was 40 years old, but standing on my porch at 8 in the morning, he looked like a lost teenager. "Dad." His voice cracked on the word. "Can we talk?" I should have said no. Should have protected myself the way I'd learned to protect Margaret, building walls against more hurt. But he was still my son. That didn't just disappear. even when you wanted it to. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, the space where Margaret's hospital bed had been. David kept looking at the empty spot, his face contorting with something that looked like physical pain. I ended things with Lily, he said abruptly. I asked her to move out. Filed for separation yesterday. I hadn't expected that. David, let me talk, please. He gripped his hands together so tightly his knuckles turned white. After the meeting, I went home and I just kept thinking about everything in those documents. Every time I'd told myself I was too busy to visit, every excuse that felt reasonable at the time, and I kept hearing Lily's voice in my head, agreeing with me, reinforcing every reason I had to stay away. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. So I started looking through our old messages, text conversations, emails, everything. And Dad, she was lying to me about so much. What do you mean? David pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Remember when Mom had that fall, about 18 months ago? You texted me to come over, I remembered. Margaret had been terrified after the fall, convinced she'd broken something even though she hadn't. She'd cried for hours, asking for David. You said you couldn't make it that day, said Lily wasn't feeling well. That's what I told you. That's what Lily told me. He turned his phone toward me. But look at this. This is her Instagram from that same day. The post showed Lily at some upscale restaurant, cocktail in hand, caption reading, "Self-care Saturday with my girls. Much needed after a crazy week." She told me she had a migraine, David said, his voice hollow. She said she couldn't handle the stress of seeing Mom like that her anxiety was too bad. I believed her. I stayed home to take care of her and she was out drinking with friends. He scrolled through more photos. Here's another one. Christmas, 2 years ago. Remember? You invited us for dinner. We said we couldn't make it because Lily's family was in town. The photo showed Lily and David at a ski resort. Just the two of them. No family. There was no family visit, David said. Lily wanted to go skiing. She told me Mom wouldn't even notice if we weren't there. That you were exaggerating how aware Mom still was. I believed her. He kept scrolling, showing me post after post, each one contradicting the excuses they'd given for missing visits, for cutting phone calls short, for maintaining their distance while Margaret slipped away. I confronted her about it all. After the meeting, I asked her why she'd lied. David's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She said she was protecting me, that watching Mom deteriorate was traumatic and I didn't need that in my life, that you were being manipulative by guilting me into visiting. That Mom was already gone, mentally, so what did it matter if I was there physically? The casual cruelty of it hit me like a fist to the chest. And you believed her? Yes. David's voice broke completely. I believed her because it was easier than believing the truth. The truth was that I was a coward. That I couldn't handle watching my mother disappear. Lily gave me permission to be that coward. She made it sound reasonable, even compassionate. Like I was protecting myself from trauma instead of abandoning my dying mother. He buried his face in his hands. How could I do that? How could I just let her disappear from my life while she was still alive? I didn't have an answer. The question had haunted me for 3 years. Now it would haunt David for the rest of his life. There's more, David said after a long moment. He looked up at me, his face ravaged. I found out why Lily was really keeping me away. It wasn't about protecting me from trauma. Then what was it about? Money. The word came out bitter. She knew about Mom's will. She knew there would be an inheritance, and she was afraid that if I spent too much time watching you care for Mom, I might offer to help financially. Might suggest we contribute to her care, or hire nurses, or do something that would cut into our savings. I felt sick. David, we have over $200,000 in savings, Dad. Money we've accumulated over 15 years. Money that could have hired full-time nursing care for Mom. Money that could have given you a break, so you didn't have to sacrifice your entire retirement. His voice was shaking with rage now. And Lily convinced me that we needed to keep that money safe for our future, that your situation was temporary, that you were handling it fine. I was handling it. You shouldn't have had to. David stood up abruptly, pacing. You shouldn't have had to drain your savings and sell your truck and work yourself into the ground, while your son sat across town with enough money to help, but did nothing. You didn't know? I should have known. He whirled on me. I should have visited enough to see how bad it was. I should have ignored Lily's excuses and been there, but I didn't. because some part of me knew that if I really saw what you were dealing with, I'd have to step up, and I didn't want to step up. The honesty of it was brutal, but it was honest, and that counted for something. David sank back into his chair. I found something else. In Lily's things, when I was asking her to pack, he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It's a printout of Mom's obituary, the one Lily wrote and submitted to the newspaper without telling either of us. He handed it to me. I unfolded it slowly. Margaret Hayes, age 65, passed away peacefully surrounded by loving family. She is survived by her devoted son David and daughter-in-law Lily, who cared for her during her long illness. Memorial service to be held at St. Paul's Church. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Alzheimer's Association in Margaret's name. Not a single mention of me. 40 years of marriage, 3 years of caregiving, and I'd been erased completely. She was going to publish this, David said. I found it in her desk drawer with a note to herself to submit it the day after the funeral. She wanted everyone to think she'd been the primary caregiver. Wanted the credit, the sympathy, all of it. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand that what happened wasn't just my weakness. It was her manipulation. She actively worked to keep me away from Mom, to keep me away from you, because she wanted to control the narrative. He looked at me with desperate eyes. I'm not saying that excuses what I did. I'm the one who made the choices. But I need you to know that she wasn't just passively enabling my cowardice. She was actively cultivating it. I sat with that information, trying to process it. Part of me had always suspected Lily was worse than just uncomfortable around illness, but knowing it for certain was different. What do you want me to say, David? I don't know. He slumped forward, elbows on his knees. I guess I just needed you to know that I'm leaving her, that I finally see what she is, and that I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back those 3 years, doesn't give me back the time I lost with Mom, but I'm saying it anyway. We sat in silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder of all the time we'd already lost. What happens now? I asked finally. I don't know, David admitted. I'm staying at a hotel while Lily moves out. The divorce will take months probably. She's already threatening to fight for everything. He laughed bitterly. She wants half of Mom's inheritance. The money from a woman she couldn't be bothered to visit even once in the last year of her life. Will she get it? My lawyer says probably. California is a community property state. Everything I inherit during the marriage is technically half hers. He shook his head. So she wins. She kept me away from Mom, got to play the devoted daughter-in-law for social media, and now she'll get paid for it. The injustice of it was staggering, but I'd learned over the past 3 years that life wasn't fair. Good people suffered. Bad people prospered, and all you could do was decide how you were going to respond. David, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. What you did, staying away, believing Lily's lies, choosing comfort over showing up, that was your choice. Lily made it easier, but you still made it, and I can't just forget that. I know, but I also need you to understand that you're still my son, and some part of me will always love you, even when I don't like you very much. His face crumpled. I don't deserve that. No, I agreed. You probably don't. But Margaret loved you until the day she died. Even when she couldn't remember your name, some part of her knew she was missing her son. She never stopped wanting you there, and I think she'd want me to give you a chance to be better than you were. How do I do that? How do I be better? I thought about it for a long moment. You start by being honest, with yourself, with me, about what you did and why. No more excuses, no more blaming everything on Lily. You own your choices, and then you live differently. David nodded slowly. Can we try? Can we figure out how to be father and son again? I don't know, I said truthfully, but maybe we can try. Slowly, carefully, with no promises and no expectations. That's more than I deserve. Yes, I said, it is. He left an hour later. We didn't hug, didn't make plans, just acknowledged that something had shifted. Maybe not healed, but at least exposed to light. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet house and thought about Margaret, about what she would have wanted. She'd asked me to take care of David in her letter, to not let him be forgotten the way he'd let her be forgotten. I wasn't sure I could do that, but I could try, for Margaret's sake, if not for my own. 8 months passed before I felt like myself again, not the self I'd been before Margaret got sick. That man was gone, buried alongside his wife in Oakwood Cemetery, but a new version. Someone who'd survived something terrible and come out the other side, changed, but not broken. I sold the house in June. Joan helped me sort through everything, dividing Margaret's possessions between things to keep, things to donate, and things to let go. David came by twice to help, awkward and careful around me, like he was afraid I might shatter if he said the wrong thing. Maybe I would have early on. But by June, I'd cried myself empty. There were no tears left, just a quiet acceptance that this was my life now. This was what moving forward looked like. I found a small apartment in a building near the coast, about 40 minutes from where Margaret and I had lived our entire marriage. It was a deliberate choice, putting distance between myself and all those memories. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a small balcony with a view of the water, and absolutely no history. The first night in the new place, I sat on that balcony with a glass of wine and watched the sunset. Margaret had always wanted to live near the ocean. We'd planned to retire somewhere coastal, rent a little cottage, spend our days walking on the beach. Another dream that Alzheimer's had stolen. But I was here now, living the dream alone. It should have felt sad. Instead, it felt peaceful. My phone rang. David. He called every Sunday now, had been doing so for the past 5 months. At first, the conversations were stilted and brief, but slowly, carefully, we'd been building something. Not the relationship we'd had before Margaret got sick, but something different, something honest. "Hey, Dad," he said when I answered. "Just checking in." "I'm good. Watching the sunset from my new balcony." "Yeah? How's the apartment?" "Quiet. Small. Perfect, actually." A pause. "I'm glad you got out of that house. I know it was hard, being there without Mom." We could talk about Margaret now. It had taken months, but David could finally say her name without his voice breaking. Progress. "How are things with the divorce?" I asked. "Almost final. Lily's lawyer keeps pushing for more, but my attorney says we're close to settlement." He sighed. "She's getting about $75,000, half of what I inherited from Mom." The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of us. Lily had worked so hard to keep David away from Margaret, and now she'd profit from Margaret's death. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be. It's worth it to be free of her." Another pause. "I've been seeing a therapist. About everything. About Mom. About how I handled it all. This was new. How's that going?" "Hard. Really hard. She doesn't let me off easy. Keeps pushing me to examine why I made the choices I did." His voice got quieter. "I'm learning a lot about myself. Not all of it good. That's brave, David. Doing that work. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like the bare minimum of what I should be doing." We talked for another 20 minutes. He told me about his job, about looking for a new apartment since Lily kept the house they'd shared. I told him about the walking trail I'd found near my building, about the neighbor's cat that had adopted me. Normal things, father and son things, not enough to erase 3 years of absence, but enough to start building something new. After we hung up, I sat with the silence for a while. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I opened the box where I'd packed Margaret's journal and the documents from the attorney's office. I hadn't looked at them since that day. Couldn't bear to. But tonight, with the ocean breeze cooling my face and the weight of 8 months of healing in my bones, I thought maybe I could. Margaret's last letter to David was on top. I read it again, slowly this time, not in a conference room surrounded by lawyers and tension, but in the quiet of my own space. Her words about David needing to take care of me stood out. At the time, I thought it was just a mother's final wish for reconciliation, but reading it now, I understood something deeper. Margaret wasn't asking David to take care of me out of obligation. She was giving him a path forward, a way to transform his guilt into something useful, a chance to be the son he hadn't been while she was alive. Whether he took that chance was up to him, but she'd offered it. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to Oakwood Cemetery. I'd been avoiding it since the funeral, unable to face that fresh grave and everything it represented. But today felt different. Margaret's headstone had been installed. Simple gray granite with her name, dates, and a line we'd chosen together years ago when we'd bought the plots. Beloved wife and mother. She loved with her whole heart. I sat on the grass beside her grave, not caring that the morning dew soaked through my jeans. "Hey, Maggie," I said softly. Margaret had always hated when I called her Maggie, but I did it anyway because it made her laugh. "I moved, got a place by the ocean like we always talked about. You'd like it. There's this little coffee shop 2 blocks away that makes terrible coffee. Which means it's exactly the kind of place you'd have loved." A bird landed on her headstone, cocked its head at me, then flew away. "David's trying," I continued. "Really trying. I don't know if we'll ever be okay, but we're talking. That's something, right? You'd be proud of him for that, I think. For at least trying to do better." The morning was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and birds calling to each other in the trees. I'm doing okay. Some days are hard, most days actually, but I'm figuring it out. learning how to be just Ross again, instead of Ross taking care of Margaret or Ross the grieving widower. I touched the cold granite of her headstone. You were right in your journal about me deserving happiness. I'm working on believing that. I stayed for another hour, not talking, just being present. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter somehow. Not healed, but healing. There's a difference. On the drive back to my apartment, I stopped at a bookstore I'd noticed near the coffee shop. I'd always loved reading, but had given it up during Margaret's illness. No time, no mental energy for anything beyond keeping her alive and comfortable. The shop was small, crammed with used books that smelled like paper and possibility. An older woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Help you find something?" "I don't know what I'm looking for," I admitted. "Best kind of browsing," she said. "Take your time." I wandered the aisles, pulling out books at random, reading first lines, putting most of them back. Then I found it, tucked in the memoir section. A book about a man who'd cared for his wife through terminal illness and rebuilt his life after. I bought it without reading past the first page. Brought it home and read the whole thing in one sitting on my balcony. The author's story wasn't exactly like mine. His wife had cancer, not Alzheimer's. They'd had more support, more family involvement, but the core of it resonated. The exhaustion, the guilt of feeling relieved when it was over, the strange emptiness of suddenly having nothing but time when you'd had none for years. The final chapter was about the author's decision to volunteer at a hospice, helping other families navigate what he'd gone through. He wrote about how helping others had helped him heal, had given meaning to his suffering. I closed the book and looked out at the ocean, thinking. 2 weeks later, I attended an orientation at a local hospice care facility. The coordinator was a woman in her 50s named Patricia, warm and professional. "We're always looking for volunteers who've been through this," she explained. "Family members who've been caregivers understand in a way others can't. You know what it's like to feel helpless, to wonder if you're doing enough, to be exhausted beyond measure." "I'm not sure I'm ready," I said honestly. "My wife only passed away 9 months ago. There's no timeline for grief," Patricia said gently. "But sometimes helping others is part of the healing process. Why don't you shadow one of our experienced volunteers for a few weeks? See how it feels. No commitment." I agreed. The first day, I met a man named Henry, who was caring for his husband of 35 years. They were both in their 70s, and the husband, James, had advanced Parkinson's. Henry was exhausted, terrified, and trying desperately to keep it together. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Henry admitted to me while James slept. "I love him so much, but I'm so tired. Does that make me terrible?" "No," I said, remembering all the nights I'd felt exactly the same way. "It makes you human." We talked for over an hour. I told him about Margaret, about the 3 years of caregiving, about the isolation and fear. Henry cried, not from sadness, but from relief that someone understood. "Did it get easier?" he asked. I thought about lying, about offering false comfort, but Henry deserved honesty. "No," I said, "it got harder, but you learn to carry it. And when it's over, when they're finally at peace, you'll know you did everything you could. That counts for something." "Does it stop hurting?" "I don't think so, but it hurts differently, less sharp, more like an old ache than a fresh wound." When I left Henry's house that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: purpose. I signed up as a regular volunteer the next week. Over the following months, I visited dozens of families, sat with exhausted caregivers, listened to their fears and frustrations, shared my own story when it seemed helpful. Sometimes I didn't say much at all, just sat with people in their grief and fear, a quiet presence that said, "You're not alone." It didn't fix what had happened with Margaret. Didn't give me back those 3 years or repair my relationship with David, but it gave me a way forward. David and I had dinner once a month now, meeting at a neutral restaurant halfway between our apartments. The conversations were still sometimes awkward, the silences still loaded with everything unspoken, but we were trying. "I went by Mom's grave last week," David said at our October dinner. "Talked to her, told her I was sorry. Told her about the therapy and the divorce and trying to be better. She'd have liked that," I said. "I don't know if I believe in heaven or anything after," David continued, "but I want to believe she somehow knows I'm trying." "She knows," I said with certainty. "Not because of heaven or ghosts or anything like that. She knows because she never stopped believing you could be better than you were. That belief lives on. In me. In you, if you let it." David's eyes filled with tears. "I miss her so much, Dad. And the worst part is, I don't even have the right to miss her. I wasn't there." You have every right to miss her. She was your mother. You loved her, even when you didn't show up. Those two things can both be true. We sat with that for a while, picking at our food, letting the hard truths settle between us. Are we going to be okay? David asked finally. You and me? I thought about it carefully before answering. I don't know if we'll ever be what we were before, but maybe we can be something else, something built on honesty instead of expectation. I'd like that, David said quietly. So would I. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, maybe it never would be, but it was forward motion, and that was enough. A year after Margaret's death, I stood on my balcony watching another sunset. My phone was off. The apartment was quiet, and for the first time in 4 years, I felt something close to peace. Margaret was gone. David and I were rebuilding slowly. Lily had her money and her false narrative. Joan called every week to check on me. My volunteer work at hospice had become the most meaningful thing in my life. It wasn't the life I'd planned. It wasn't the retirement Margaret and I had dreamed about, but it was mine, built from the ashes of everything I'd lost. And somehow, against all odds, I was okay. Not happy, not yet, but okay. And okay was enough to build on. The ocean stretched out before me, endless and patient. Tomorrow I'd wake up and live another day, visit another family, have another phone call with David, sit with another sunset. I'd survive. I'd heal, slowly, and I'd honor Margaret's memory not by staying frozen in grief, but by learning to live again. That's what she would have wanted. That's what her final letter had asked for. So that's what I would do. One day at a time, one sunset at a time, one small act of healing at a time, I would live.